So when we spoke briefly at the Trudeau conference last year, you told me that you joined the delegation that went down to the UN to lobby states to oppose patriation. So can you just tell me a little bit about that?
Well, so I think I need to be very clear that I was on the fringes of that delegation. I was, in a way, a witness to it. I think that would be the best way to describe my place there. And it was not an official role. I was there in the company of my husband, Stephen Cacfui, who was there representing the Dene Nation. I was living in Quebec City at the time, and the truth of the matter is the CBC, Radio-Canada, where I was working, was on strike. And so I had availability for the first time to be able to do something like this. And I mention that because, nonetheless, I was still in a journalistic chapter of my career, and I was very aware of that, and I was very aware of my journalistic obligations of objectivity and detachment and so on. So I went along, as I say, as my husband's spouse, and I was an observer, but at no point was I involved in the discussions in any kind of formal way, or did I speak about any of these things. So anything I can share with you is just what I remember and what I saw.
Right.
And, yeah. So we joined, I know it's all about a train, but we actually joined in Montreal, which was all about a bus. And it was, we drove down in a chartered bus through... it was the first time that either of us had ever been to New York, so, quite a fascinating experience just to arrive in that city. And at that time, it was a time when there was still a lot of nervousness about the safety of New York City. And I remember arriving in the context of, a bus full of Indigenous people, and arriving in downtown New York City and going into a place that looked like this most stunning, elaborate hotel that we had ever seen. And it was all kind of crystal chandeliers and red plush, this and that in the lobby. And then landing in our rooms, which were like tiny little closets that you literally had to squeeze your suitcase in first, and then your body, and then close the door, because so tight was the door up to the bed that you couldn't fully open the door itself.
Wow.
And I say that because it ended up, I think, in a way, kind of underscoring for me, in a kind of metaphorical way, the great gaps between the optics of things and the reality of things, in terms of what people say and their intentions, and regarding the relations with Indigenous people, and then what actually unfolds, and the reality that is lived out by Indigenous people in so many parts of the world. In this context, it was Canada, because these were in the months leading up to the constitutional talks and before the patriation of the Canadian Constitution. The other thing, not that it's relevant, I think, to what you're writing about, but the other thing that was very memorable, because we were all put on hyper alert, it was probably good. It was probably a good way of making streetwise a bunch of people, many of whom were from fairly remote parts of Canada, to the challenges of the big city. But in the time between we going in to get registered in our rooms and coming back out to get our suitcases and whatever out of the bus had been broken into, and the bus driver's sound system, which at that time was the old thing that we used to call ghetto blasters or whatever, those they were all sort of all-purpose pieces of equipment. But it had been stolen from his bus, just in the amount of time it took us all to go in and get checked in and come out again. So that was kind of like, okay,
wow, yeah,
pay attention. We're in the big city, and things are not necessarily what they seem or what you're used to. So that was the opening, and then what I remember the rest of it, and I cannot even remember with specificity what all delegations. There was a kind of a fanning out at that point among the various members of the delegation. I think there were probably representatives from about 26 different regions there, because I think about the bus itself and how many people were on it, and they were divided into little pods, and nobody went to an embassy by them or to nation state offices by themselves. There were always 2 or 3 in each little delegation. And I remember that one of the ones we went to was Tanzania, but I don't remember what the other one was, and there might have been 3, and I just don't remember now. But what I do remember is that they were all, we experienced them all as very positive receptions, and very, but I mean, there's a part of me, even then, but now, that understands it's the world of the UN where people are groomed in diplomacy, and no one's going to be discourteous, but they also get a million demands to meet with a million people, and they could have said no, and they didn't. So we were there. The very fact that people were invited into the rooms was already felt and experienced as something worthwhile. But the thing that I do remember very clearly, and this in some ways was the most profound part of it all, is being on the streets, on the sidewalks of New York, in front of, just across the road, in fact, from the United Nations building there, and having the elder Albert Lightning doing ceremony on the sidewalk. And we were all gathered around and doing sacred ceremony before we went in. It was such a profound centering for all of us, but also just the courage, really, to do that in such a public way, and I would say in a vulnerable way, because there was no way of foretelling how that would, be received there, and what the response would be, and so on. And it was a way of really, I think, centering everyone on the purpose as being not a political purpose, but a profoundly sacred purpose of speaking up for ancient rights and responsibilities, and feeling that there was every right in the world for that to be known to the wider world in the context of the UN. So that's what I remember first and foremost. The other things I remember are tiny details that had nothing whatsoever to do with it, like going to see the movie The Blues Brothers in New York City. We couldn't afford to go to a Broadway show, so we went to a movie, and that's what I remember seeing, The Blues Brothers. Yeah. And but what I also remember more than anything else is that weekend that we were there was the weekend that John Lennon was assassinated, and that was a huge thing for us. I hope I'm not getting my trips mixed up in my mind about that. I might be, actually, but I don't think so. I think that was the same time. Can you Google that, where you are?
Sure.
When John Kennedy died? And just make sure I'm not talking through my hat on that. I wouldn't want to. I know Stephen and I were there when John Kennedy was, or I'm saying John Kennedy, excuse me, John Lennon was assassinated.
Well, you're not the first one to bring that up with me. So, other people have the same memory. Yeah, December 8th, 1980. Yeah. So that would have been, the same time.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and we were there, and I remember us being in our little, I told you about the hovel of our room, and we had the radio on. I don't think there was even a TV in the room, but I can't recall that for sure. There might have been. But I do remember we were listening to radio, and I remember that we were in this room over the sounds of the city and everything. We could hear all these sirens, like on and on and on, all these sirens, and we were saying, and remember, we had just been robbed from the bus, right? So I remember saying, oh my God, there's a lot of crime in this place. It's everywhere. And listen to all these police, and do people have to live with this all the time? And then maybe it was then that we heard on the radio that John Lennon had been shot and had been killed.
Wow.
And then I remember going the next day to Central Park and walking over towards his apartment building. And while we were walking through the park, this part is so bizarre to me, so surreal, and it would never happen now. I think about it now, but we were walking through Central Park, and there was a reporter team, TV team, and there was a reporter standing there with the album cover that had the signature on it, and he's holding this, and he's using it as a prop for his report, and he's basically holding this album that has John Lennon's last living handwriting on it. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is such an extraordinary moment. It was almost, as they say, surreal.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about it now, and I think that would never have happened. I mean, that would have been grabbed as evidence, and it would have been DNA'd and all of that. This was not then. I mean, that was not now, I mean to say.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So was the delegation, the bus that was chartered, was that specifically part of the Constitution Express movement or affiliated with another?
No, it was absolutely my understanding. The person who was sort of the leader of the bus, as I recall it, was Chief Wayne Christian.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Yeah.
I know him well. And I've done quite a bit of work with Wayne.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was the first time that I had met him. I'm not sure if my husband Stephen knew him already. He may have through previous denonation work. I'm not positive of that, but I do know that that experience sort of cemented a bond. And I know that whenever we see Wayne, which is not often, but we do run into him from time to time here and there, there's always a special connection.
Wow. Yeah.
In fact, we saw him this summer during one of the Canada 150 things out west that we were at related to CP Rail, and he was at one of the gatherings, and it was kind of like an old, not a homecoming, that would be the wrong way, but it would be like a bunch of old veterans getting together.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be like a Legion meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and people kind of reminiscing and swapping stories about that, because it really was a pivotal thing. And then I should say that my next engagement with all of this, right on the heels of all this, actually, because I was in Quebec, and I was there as a national reporter for CBC, and that was during the first referendum. But we had gone on strike, and we were on strike for a long time. And one of the things that happened shortly after that is I was working during the strike for the provincial government, and they had at that time, I'm not sure if they still have it, a monthly news magazine called Rencontre, and it was in French and English, and it was a publication of their Office of Indigenous Affairs, which was called SAGMI at the time, and that office reported directly through their deputy to Levesque. René Levesque maintained that direct, basically government-to-government relationship in his own portfolio. And as one of my reporting assignments, I went to northern Quebec and then to Nunavut, where the Inuit were meeting, and as it happened, got storm stayed there. There was a big blizzard, and so I ended up in the back rooms of the back rooms. By that I mean the meeting rooms of the Inuit, who were preparing for their positioning at the constitutional talks that were coming up. And so between these two experiences, I had these extraordinary, both of them serendipitous opportunities to really listen firsthand to some of the people who would end up being key players at the constitutional talks in arguing for the inclusion of Indigenous rights, Aboriginal rights as they were called at the time, into the Canadian Constitution, which, as we all know, came to be in Section 35. But I sat there because of the weather, because we were stormed in, and what was supposed to have been I think a 1 or 2 day meeting ended up being a 5-day meeting, and they just kept digging deeper, and it was a wonderful, rich insight for me into the brilliance of all these Inuit minds. And there were lawyers in the room, but I tell you, there were any number of Inuit who could just as easily have received a law degree from the work that they had done on that constitutional preparation. And then when the constitutional talks came to happen in Ottawa, by then, because that was then a couple of years later, I had moved back Stephen and I had moved back to the Northwest Territories. The strike was kind of relentless, so I eventually left Quebec, went back north, and then television had finally started up in northern Canada. And I was, though I was an experienced radio reporter, I was a young television reporter, and I was invited to be part of the national broadcast team for covering the constitutional talks. And so I worked on the broadcast team with Peter Mansbridge and others, and was brought in as sort of it sounds almost shameful to say it now, but the truth is this was such new territory for most people in the country, including most journalists. And because of these experiences and my experience living and working in the North among Indigenous people for so long, I was brought in as somewhat of an issues expert, and the constitutional talks. And I remember so many times thinking that I owed that education to the Inuit and the First Nations chiefs from that forum in Iqaluit and that constitutional caravan that went to New York. Wow.
Did you write about or report on the New York experience?
No, I did not. I did not. Partly because I had not, because I was on strike. I was in this funny middle land. I was still an employee of the CBC, Radio-Canada, the CBC, but I was governed by the Quebec Union, which is different from the union. At that time, it was different from the union that ran the rest of the CBC. So I was governed by the Quebec Union and was on strike in Quebec, but I was an employee of the English network.
Right.
And so I was in an odd situation, and I didn't want to do anything that might be used to, especially in the context of a strike where everyone's twitchy anyway. And that was the longest strike, to this day, the longest strike in the history of the CBC.
Oh, wow.
And so it went on for over 7 months. And I didn't want to compromise my future career, my ability to be called back and to be reassigned and so on. So I just, I took it as a gift, and I gleaned what I could out of it for my own enrichment, but I didn't write about it.
Right. And so you talked a bit about how states received you. What exactly were people on the delegation proposing or asking them for? What were they lobbying?
And I'm really not the right one. First of all, when you say received you, I would have to say received you, like the plural you.
Yes, exactly.
I was a tag along.
Yeah.
I was a kind of quiet observer in the corner. I never sat at the tables or anything like that.
Okay.
But the overall point, and others can certainly speak to this with greater precision, but I think the overall point was really a strategic one to say that, for one thing, many Indigenous nations in Canada do not have relationship limits that stop at the borders of Canada as a nation state. They have relatives and relations and history of connections that cross those borders. So so partly it was recognizing that they were not limited in the Canadian context to what their issues were, but I think also to really elevate the fact that they were talking from the perspective of their perceived rights as nations. And so go to a place that understands that language and that understands that purpose. And I think strategically for anyone who goes internationally as well, to register that sometimes a country, in this case Canada, can see itself best as others see it from the outside. And anyone who's traveled knows that. Sometimes we don't see our own country well till we leave it and look back at it from somewhere else or from some other experience. And I think that's true for the country as a whole, that sometimes it's the people who see it from the outside in that are able to hold up new insights about ourselves that we haven't necessarily seen for ourselves. And sometimes that includes political pressure. I mean, no one likes the neighbors elsewhere to have something to say about something you may or may not be doing properly or correctly or adequately. And so I think it was partly that too, is to make the light that would be shone on Canada in these really, really important conversations, make the spotlight be bigger so that there are kind of honest brokers paying attention and making sure that it's being done fairly. And because at the time they were talking about the patriation of the Constitution, it already involved Great Britain, because there was, first of all, the patriation of the Constitution itself, and then the opening up of it to consider things that needed to be added to amplify it. And that's where the inclusion of Indigenous rights came in. Aboriginal rights, as it's called in the Constitution.
Right. And so as an observer, did you find that, did it seem like those states were understood what the Indigenous people who were in the room were asking for, like what their vision and message was?
Yeah, and so that's where I say, like, I'm really sorry. I don't want to make up an answer for that. I just don't remember that part of it. All I remember is that these were not testy meetings. Mm-hmm. They were not argumentative meetings. They were not, who the hell do you think you are kind of meetings. They were diplomatic meetings, and there was diplomacy as I remember it. I remember the feeling of it rather than the substance of it. There was diplomacy on all sides.
Mm-hmm. And what was the feeling? What did it feel like, just being part of what was going on? What was the vibe?
Well, I mean, if it was completely unexpected, I mean, the fact is that Dene Nation is far away compared to other First Nations in Canada geographically, mm-hmm. and always hard and very expensive to have proper representation at any national tables or national initiatives. And it so happened, because I was living in Quebec, that Stephen was down there with me at that time, and he got a call from, at that time, it's referred to as the president rather than the Grand Chief, but the president of the Dene Nation at that time, George Erasmus, had contacted him and asked him if he would participate. And in a way, like, it's an economic way to do it because he's already 3/4 of the way there,
right.
And so, so it came quite suddenly, is my point. And because it was a bus and it was provided, and I was on strike and I was there and I had time and availability, I think it was over a long weekend, as I recall. It wasn't like we were going away for a week or 10 days or something. There must have been some work days in there because of the delegation, but I remember it being like sort of 4 or 5 days, it seems to me. I could break away. I mean, I had to get a day off of the job I was doing. I don't remember that part of it very well. But I got to go along. So just being able to be on the inside of something, it to me just seemed like such a good fortune. And I mean, I just felt very fortunate. But I also felt, in a funny way, liberated. I was, for this temporary moment, out of the confines of my journalistic girdle, I guess I'll put it that way. Where I could be somewhere. I didn't have to be in that confine of no media allowed. I wasn't there functioning as media, so I could be in the room. And that was a great privilege. Because it was I was on the receiving end of really good fortune and enrichment and learning, to be in rooms that I wouldn't otherwise have been in. And I just remember feeling so lucky. And of course I was stimulated. I had previously lived in Africa and taught there for a couple of years. So to be in the very environment of the international nature of the United Nations was completely invigorating for me. At that time, I had held aspirations of being a foreign correspondent, and so it was absolutely up my bailiwick, as it were. But things changed because I ended up marrying into the Dene Nation and living north, which was a different kind of international experience. But the notion of an international community and the kind of thrust and jive of all that, the complexity of it, the richness of it, and so on, was already in my blood. And to be able to be there with a specific issue on the table for people to chew on, it just seemed to me really, really fortunate. But what I have to say is that the benefits of that were not conscious and deliberate at the time, in my mind. I got lucky. I got to be there. I paid attention. I mean, I didn't take it as, I'm going to New York. I'm going to go to some shows and go shopping. I didn't do any of that. I just hung around and watched and listened. And I didn't know at the time to what extent that would actually be a gift to me that would serve me well. And I hope serve the national conversation well, because I could give more informed and substantive contributions to what became the national CBC coverage of these very, very important conversations, which, we don't register it necessarily now, but every time there's a court case that goes forward on Aboriginal rights, there's always reference to Section 35, and to stand back from that later in your life and say, I got to be on the in the preliminary conversations around that. I got to be at the table when that got, or at least at the media tables when that was being analyzed and negotiated and debated. And now to see how it has played out and how it has been used as a legal tool for insisting on those things has been a great and wealthy part of my professional life.
It's interesting, it's really interesting to hear about just the feeling of being part of that, in those rooms at the UN, because I think this was really just the start of Indigenous peoples going down to the UN and doing international organizing in that way, right? The World Council of Indigenous Peoples had just been launched. At that stage, there were, George Manuel was the first one to get an Indigenous organization even accredited to appear at the UN. So I really think, this was early days of Indigenous organizing at the UN, well before the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was even a glimmer or a hope. And of course, I've been thinking about this week. 2 days ago, of course, we marked the 10-year anniversary of the Declaration, right? And so trying to think about the connections between those early organizing, those early days of organizing at the UN, and then what we have now. Yeah.
And I just came from Montreal, where I don't know if you saw, but the mayor and the city there has they've declared all kinds of initiatives in the spirit of reconciliation, including the unveiling of a new municipal flag that has anchored right in the very center of it a symbol representing the Indigenous homeland upon which Montreal was built. And there are banners all over downtown Montreal this very week that say, "Proud of our Indigenous roots." That is a huge shift. And there was a major conference organized, and I was on one of the panels, all about commemorating the 10-year anniversary of the UN Declaration. And, some of the pioneers and architects of that work were there on the panel with me. And my purpose in inclusion in that panel was to talk about how the UN Declaration is not just a declaration, but a living tool, and how we're meant to use it in an active way. And the opportunity I had was to remind people and describe for them how it had informed the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how we refer to that declaration as being the framework for ongoing reconciliation. And then in our 94 calls to action, 16 of them actually cite, specifically cross-reference the UN Declaration. And so it's, one fire has fed the next fire, has led the next fire. And as I stand back from my own life and career, I realize, really how fortunate and how, I hope purposefully, I have been allowed to move from one chapter of that story to the next, and have the connective tissue which a lot of times people dealing with issues don't have the longer context. They're plopped in and have to try to make sense of something that may be quite unfamiliar. And I've had the great blessing of seeing this from its really early nub of an ocean days to how where it has led and how it now needs to be fanned to be kept alive and active and eventually normalized, so that these are not issues we're struggling with, but are new ways of being as a country.
Wow, that's amazing. On the topic of the TRC, I've been in touch with Willie Littlechild a bit, and I haven't had a full conversation with him, but he's sort of hinted that the development of Section 35 and the Indigenous people's opposition to patriation were considered during your TRC deliberations. So I thought I might just ask you a bit about that. So how did that come to play in the deliberations of the TRC?
Well, that's a better conversation to have with Willie.
Sure.
Willie, and it's also important to know that I always refer to Willie. He doesn't use terminology, but I always do because I know it's true. You know, he was one of the architects of the UN Declaration. I mean, there were many people involved in it, but he was definitely one of them. And he was both in Geneva and in New York many times over the decades, the 2 decades, or more than 2 decades that it took to get to the point of signing off on the UN Declaration. And certainly on the Declaration itself, he has all of that history much more sharply entrenched. He lived it in ways that I did not.
But what about specifically Section 35 and the Indigenous peoples' sort of movements around getting constitutional recognition? Did that come into the TRC conversation very much?
Well, just only in the sense that we agreed. I don't remember there being a big debate or deliberation about it, but maybe there were conversations between Willie and Murray. I don't know.
Okay.
I do know that we, quite early on and quickly agreed that the UN Declaration was not some parallel process, but that it was something that was directly relevant to what we were doing, and that we needed to embed it into our own conclusions.
Right.
But I don't remember there being any sort of hesitation or pushback on that. I think it was pretty easily and quickly agreed upon.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I don't remember specifically lots of deep conversation about Section 35, except all of us have said many times that that it has been frustrating over the years, that it always seems to have to end up back in court to challenge that. It's not like Section 35 has become top of mind for decision makers, but the UN Declaration could and can, and to the extent that people are paying attention to the TRC calls to action, which seems to be the case, at least in many sectors, the cross-referencing there becomes important. And we do also talk about not just the UN Declaration, we talk about the treaty rights and the constitutional rights that Indigenous peoples have and that they need to be honored and recognized. That we do talk about both in our calls to action, some of them specifically, and in our the principles of reconciliation that we articulated as preface to our calls to action.
Right. Yeah, thank you. No, just something that Willie flagged for me, so I just thought, while I have you, just to bring it up. But no, that's helpful.
You might well have more to say about that, but by all means. But I don't remember there being any kind of big specific, fulsome conversation specifically about Section 35, except to say that it doesn't seem to be enough to just have it on paper. The issue is, how do you live it?
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to go back to something you said before about.
I have to be somewhere in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm going to make a suggestion here.
Yeah.
I have to walk there. So if you can give me 5 minutes and call me back in 5 minutes, I can talk to you while I'm walking if you've got some more questions, and then I would probably have about 10 more minutes I could give you at that point.
Sure, if that's okay with you. I mean, whatever you're comfortable with. I mean.
Well, it's just my day's crazy, and
I'm sure.
and I'm going to be gone for an extended period of time, so it's kind of now or never.
Okay.
But I do have to get going, because I have to be physically somewhere else. It's not far, but I got to get going there. So just give me 5 minutes and call me back,
Okay.
and then we can talk as I walk.
That sounds fantastic. Okay, thanks so much.
Okay. Hi, Ellen.
Hi. Are you ready? Is this good timing?
Yes, the only thing is I'm going down an elevator, so if I lose you, you'll have to call again.
Okay, no problem.
All right.
So thanks again for giving me a little extra time.
Okay.
So I just thought I might ask a couple of quick last questions, drawing on your perspective as a journalist who really was on the front lines of this. So something you said a couple of minutes ago about being at the media tables during the constitutional negotiations and then the conferences. I just thought I might ask about sort of what that was like. What was the attitude or understanding of the media towards Indigenous rights at that time?
When I say I was at the media tables, I was part of the CBC national broadcast team. Mm-hmm. So my references were, and those were big, demanding conversations.
Yeah.
And the deadlines were tight, and they were relentless, and it was before all the gadgetry that we have today for things to be fast. So, tape was being edited and all of that. So we're talking the 80s. We didn't all have cell phones. I mean, all those things. We didn't even have computers. So we're talking about a different time altogether. But what we did have was live broadcasts. And so my experiences were tied to that. And what I thought at the time, I don't know if this is to the heart of your question, but what I thought at the time was, thank God we have a national public broadcaster with a mandate to pay attention to such things, because it was before the 500 channel universe, and it was at a time when everybody in Canada could be part of the same conversation. It was broadcast, the constitutional talks. I wasn't at the negotiations. I was at the coverage of the public talks and the negotiations are not the same thing. I wasn't in the back rooms of the negotiations, but I was in the conference center in Ottawa, right, with all the premiers around the table and the national Indigenous organizations, and I was on the floor as part of that broadcast team. And that's what I thought, because people back home from coast to coast to coast were watching live on CBC and Radio Canada, and were paying attention to what it was. And so it was a very shared experience. And when I reflect on that now, I think about how hard it is to create and hold on to a shared national experience, because we're so fractured in the ways in which we receive it, in the ways in which we talk about it and experience it. So much of the conversation is in bite-sized tweets or whatever, or hope that's supposed to capture it all, and not many for substantive conversation and to see. Can you still hear me?
Yep, we're good.
Okay. To see national leadership, both from public government and from Indigenous government, speaking to each other in a shared circle of diplomacy, in a shared space. It was extraordinary to see the extent to which, and this is one of the things that really stands out for me about those constitutional talks, the extent to which each of the delegations had their own positions, but to what extent they were able, and God knows what fighting and negotiating it might have taken behind the scenes, but to the extent to which they were able to stand and speak in solidarity as First Peoples, as Aboriginal peoples, as not as one collective, but as collection of collectives, if I can put it that way, and to be in solidarity with each other, sort of impenetrable from a kind of divide and conquer point of view on constitutional rights. That was a wonderful thing to see.
Wow. Yeah, really, that was the last thing I wanted to pick up on, but is there anything else you'd like to add or discuss about that time?
Well, what can I say? I would say one of the things that we deprive ourselves of as a country, when we don't listen to some of the great voices coming from places other than our own, and by that I mean whatever geographic or cultural background we're from, is that we miss some of the beauty and the wealth of it all. And I remember some of the comments that were made by some of the Indigenous leaders, and it was so articulate, it was so in some ways poetic at times, and it was so powerful. And it was just, for me, I thought, finally we have a table that feels like it could and should be a table of equal voices, because certainly the strength and intelligence and vision from around the table is no less, if anything, is more sharply described from the Indigenous voices than from anywhere else around the table. And it was a gift to us all that. I think, teachers across the country I know are looking at how do they find curricula and such for teaching about Indigenous rights and reconciliation, which reconciliation is it's not limited to, but it includes for sure recognition of Indigenous rights. And that means becoming far more knowledgeable about what that actually means in the law and then potentially in practice. And if people were to pull out from the national records of the CBC and elsewhere those comments and statements made from those constitutional talks, you would be able to refresh today's generation with some of the brilliance of their past leaders, because it was something to behold.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I feel like there's often a missed opportunity when we talk about reconciliation, or as you're saying, public education about Indigenous rights. Often we feel like, where do we start, or feel like we have to sort of reinvent the wheel, when in fact there's been so much strong leadership from Indigenous peoples for, over 150 years now. So it's just listening to what those messages were is so deeply impactful.
Well, the other thing that's really interesting is if you look at the constitutional talks and you look at the leadership that was around the table there, I don't know if I could say none, because I can't remember with certainty, but I think almost none of the federal or provincial people who were there at the time, almost none, are still with us today. Right. And yet I know that several of the strong voices from the Indigenous perspective are still in our midst. Mm-hmm. They're still there, and have never left the tables in a way, whether they're at formal tables or whether they're continuing their work in other fora. I mean, take somebody like George Erasmus, who then went on to lead the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and then went on to provide the chair leadership of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Mm-hmm. It's just same old message, different forum, different application, but the principles are the same. People like my husband, Stephen Kaku, who was at those talks, not at the main table, but very actively behind. People like Mary Simon. People like Zebedee Nunga, who are still around. Charlie Watt. These people are still active, in different fora. And it underscores another thing, which I think is really important for young people to register. Part of the reason that there are so many of those Indigenous people still with us, and they aren't all, we've lost some for sure, but because they were so much younger, these were young, determined leaders. And they had mandates from their home communities and their elders and chiefs and community leadership. But they also had the determination and passion of youth and the stamina of youth. And they were, in a way, speaking up against what were acknowledged as the political elders of the country, who were the premiers and the prime minister, though we had a young prime minister and the former Mr. Trudeau. Mm-hmm. But they were by and large, on average, at least a generation younger, and they were speaking up. And I think that's an important thing for today's young people to know, that there's not a too soon to pay attention and to be involved and to be focused and to be relentless, but that has to come with a grounding and a sanction and an endorsement from the elders and the leadership back home, so that it's anchored in something that is much older than they are.
Right. Well, I was also going to ask you who else you think I should make sure to talk to. So I feel like you've just given me a bit of a short list. Is there anyone else you think I should definitely try to reach out to?
Well, I just happened to see this week, Zebedee Nungak has been fairly quiet. He's in northern Quebec. He was a beautiful voice at those talks. I mean, he's such a gifted speaker anyway, but he's just published a book. Oh. I'm not in my room now, so I can't, and I haven't memorized the title, but, and his last name, Nungak.
Yep.
Nungak. So you can find it.
Yep. Sometimes
it gets spelled Gaq, so it depends on the spelling.
Okay.
But, find his book. There might be some of it in there, and you might also tell you how to reach him.
Yeah.
And then Mary Simon is in Ottawa, and Stephen Cackley's in Yellowknife.
Yep.
And you can find all these people.
Okay.
So, and they can tell you others as well. Charlie Watt is in Ottawa in the Senate.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. This is
okay.
Very helpful.
I'm at my destination. I need to go.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking this time. It's been fantastic. Yep. I totally understand. I will get it to you as soon as I'm able. Great. Thank you very much. Bye. Take care.